Greetings and salutations, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm Joe St. Egg Benedictus, just on a beautiful trail today in the marshlands of St. Simon's Island, which is on the southeast coast of Georgia. And I'm finally answering that question, what is a mystic? I want to give a shout out to my pal Mike and to all the visionaries and mystics out there. I've gotten several people over the course of the 2 years I've been making videos asking, what do you mean when you say mystic? What's a mystic? And never really sure how to interpret the question because you can just easily Google it. I mean, that's what I would do if I have a question. I just Google it. So I'm not sure if some of those questions are out of a source of ambivalence or discomfort or just curiosity. And I'm hoping for the latter. I'm an educator, so I'm always eager for people who want to expand their knowledge. But if you want to debate if mystics are heretics or if that's too Catholic, according to some Baptists, then you just move along. When I say mystic or the mystic, when we say mystic, we really need to define what we're talking about as in terms of formality or informality. Formally, when you talk about mystics, you can talk about them as a group, a formal group, notably saints and other theologians and writers that came about between the 10th and the 14th century. Mystics such as Julian Honoric, or you can even argue that St. Francis of Assisi is somewhat of a mystic. Joan of Arc was a mystic. And even some modern day writers such as Meister Eckhart or Martin Buber are considered by many to be mystics, one being the German mystic and Martin Buber being more of a theologian in the 20th century. So you can talk about mystics or mysticism as a popular movement. You can talk about mysticism as a spirituality or a spiritual type or spiritual movement that is comprehensive in scope, in which you talk about mystics being those people who are ultimately trying to not only unite with God or come into communion with God usually through a spiritual program of contemplation or meditation, prayer, but also through through the mediums. And I don't mean mediums as in like witches. I'm talking about the medium as in like tools or resources to connect deeper to God, such as the environment or through prayer, obviously, through worship. And so when we talk about mysticism as a spirituality, you can really have different mystics in different traditions, like Rashi or Gandhi as being a mystic, or Hindu mystics, and so on and so forth. But according to Bradley Holt, who's the author of Thirsty for God, a brief history of Christian spirituality, mysticism is a form of spirituality that sets at its goal unity with God, in which people who show a predisposition for mystic or mysticism sees the world or tends to see the world, according to Holt, as charged with divine energy. I usually use the term borrowed, and I can't remember who said this, as being detectives of the divine. People who approach the world with arms wide open and hearts open to see God, to join God at work in the world, to be to ride the waves of the Spirit, and really to connect with God in more experiential ways rather than, say, ways that engage intellectual scholarship or more formal ways of study, and who want to make as a goal the ability to articulate the architecture, if you will, of the spiritual life or a divine relationship or a relationship with God. And informally, that means that mystics are usually those people who really value experience and their relationship with God, or their experience of God, living into the Spirit, being filled with the Spirit, walking according to the Spirit, in some cases over and against, say, trying to domesticate or control God by trying to understand God or to put God in a specific doctrinal or theological box. Um, you know, for many people, the goal of a relationship with God is to understand God, or to make God fit into a certain theology or a certain doctrinal statement or a set of legal codes, or to enforce and legislate that understanding. Whereas mystics tend to be more experiential in that they focus more on relationship as experience rather than understanding. One of my favorite passages of recently that I've preached in my church recently came from 2nd Chronicles, the first 6 chapters, where Solomon goes about building the temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. And in chapter 5, the building is complete, the temple is complete. They put all the furniture in there. Solomon gathers all the priests and the Levites and all the people, and they come and congregate. And in the midst of worship, Scripture says in 2nd Chronicles 5, when they were of one voice, united, the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah glory, filled the temple with glory. A smoke or a cloud came to descend upon the Holy of Holies and filled the temple to the point where the ministers didn't even have room to minister. They were almost like pushed out by this thick cloud of God's glory. And right when you transition to chapter 6, verse 1, Solomon affirms and says, Lord, you said that you would come in a thick darkness. It's walking into that darkness, which is a place of unknowing. One early mystic, an unknown author, writing really for mystics and saints of his time or her time, wrote a writing called The Cloud of Unknowing. And the ability for people to have the courage and the faith to walk into God's darkness, to walk into that cloud of unknowing with hearts open, with eyes open wide to the full, seeing the world as being a place in which the fullness of God dwells, gets at the heart of what mysticism really is, or what it means to be a mystic and a visionary. That's why I say visionaries and mystics, because visionaries are people who have their eyes open to the wider world, to something outside of themselves. And mystics are the ones who are willing to enter into those deep places in life, that cloud of unknowing, those places of mystery, with the full expectation that God is at work even in those places. And it's one of joy and of discovery and of deep abiding faith that God is with us. It's what Rudolf Otto calls mysterium tremendum fascinans, which means that God is mysterious, and that mystery brings feelings of fear as well as fascination. And so often you'll find that mystics tend to always be at odds or have abrasive relationships with the church bureaucracy and bureaucracies, and for many practical purposes, clergy. That's why mystics are often outside of the church, or they're often cloistered, or always charting a path that runs against the grain of business as usual. Joan of Arc being a great example of somebody who was martyred for picking the wrong side of a political battle. But you think of other people like John Henry Cardinal Newman, who in the Catholic Church was a tremendous writer, had an acute ability to articulate the interiority of his spiritual life, to draw out that architecture of the spiritual life, but at the same time was, quite controversial with the hierarchy of the church. There are several things that I think unite mystics or identify mystics. One, I've already mentioned, this ability to articulate the interiority or the architecture of walking with God or being filled with the Spirit. The ability to use poetry and to push language in order to express and be able to communicate the fullest expression of what it means to be in communion with God. Julian of Norwich, for instance, talked about her relationship with God as being a marriage, and she's a very heavy language of love and of matrimony to communicate that. So this interiority that really focuses on the experiential, and in that way, in many ways, it's prophetic because it's very earthy. It's prophetic in that it communicates where God is at work in the world, and often the prophets are the first ones to get killed when it comes to expressing where God is at work. And Jesus himself said that prophets go to Jerusalem to die, because it's usually the prophetic work of the mystics that report back from the frontier of the spiritual life, of new terrains and unrecognizable terrains in some points, to the point where usually because of the ability for mystics to discuss about God's movement, and usually on the margins of life, that they rub up against the hierarchy and the bureaucracies of power and privilege that is often found in the seat or the heart of the church. And that reminds me of another thing or another aspect that identifies mystics, and that's of its egalitarian nature. Because mystics are always outside of the boundaries of the hierarchy, often. And usually are those voices from the margins that accentuate experience, sometimes in the face of doctrine or in the face of domestication of God. It has always been, from the earliest church history, very egalitarian. Both men and women being detectives of the divine to communicate on those frontiers of the spiritual life, the contours of what it means to be in unity with God. And so you find that within a very patriarchal structure, that is the Catholic Church up and through the Reformation, and then with the Reformation, a continual expression of patriarchy within the Reformed Church, even today, with Reformed churches that have elder boards that are all male. You find mysticism in its fullest expression in the egalitarian nature that you can be a man or a woman and be a vessel of doxology and poetic expression to communicate what it means to be united with God. And so it's been highly egalitarian. And that leads again to another facet, and these are all interconnected, and that is of the eclectic nature of what it means to be a mystic. Mystics are always ecumenical, meaning they're always borrowing, because they're trying to expand the boundaries of communion with God or understanding, or defining or writing about that geography, that spiritual geography or the ecosystem of the spiritual life. Always looking for other traditions and across multi-Christian and interfaith and inter-Christian paradigms to communicate most clearly how God is at work, not only in the world but within the heart and within community. It's not uncommon to find folks like Thomas Merton, for instance, who studied Buddhism and Eastern, and looked into Eastern forms of spirituality to more inform his Christian spirituality. And so it's not a hostile kind of spirituality, but it's a very ecumenical or open spirituality that allows other faiths and other traditions to inform one's own spirituality, knowing that God is at work in places we least expect. And I think that's why, I always welcome the mystics and visionaries. And I don't see myself as a mystic per se, but I've been very informed by that mystical movement of egalitarianism, of that experiential, spirit-filled life, to live according to the Spirit, which in a lot of cases makes me a minister who's more comfortable with uncertainty who inspires me not to have all the answers, which I think sometimes gets some people at my church annoyed, and is willing to let God do what God does best. And there are times when God knows more than we do, and it's okay not to have all the answers, to live into that uncertainty, and to allow God to provide. And also to have that gift of being able to see in interfaith relationships and inter-Christian relationships that, though I am a Baptist at heart and a staunch Baptist at that, that we can allow other traditions to inform our spirituality. My Baptist walk is one that is very eclectic, in that I use, and many of you know, or started using this year, the Book of Common Prayer to inform my daily prayers, in which I serve a church that follows the rhythm of the Christian year. We do everything from Lent and Ash Wednesday, and as Bradley Holt says, inspires me to see the world filled with divine energy that I want to be a part of. I believe as a Christian that Jesus is God incarnate, and therefore we serve a God who is willing to be incarnate in the flesh, in a way that relates to my humanity, and relates to the humanity and our human condition, in a way in which this God is powerful enough to be creator of heaven and earth and almighty and omniscient and omnipresent, but also a God who is chosen to plane, a God who is chosen to walk in my skin and to let the soil of the earth creep in between his toes when he was walking this earth, allowed the salt of his tears to press against his lips. And there's something about that God in the person of Jesus Christ, fully expressed in the advent of the Paraclete, the Spirit, that has convinced me that being a Christian is the way, the truth, and the life that Jesus says of himself among a world filled with religion and faiths. And so this thing we adhere to, this Christian walk, as people of faith in a Trinitarian God, three persons co-equal, three persons in one, to me finds its fullest expression in a spiritual life, kata pneuma, according to the Spirit, in which we have to be courageous to walk in the midst of God's mystery, and to affirm with Solomon that God shows up sometimes in the dark mystery, that sometimes fills us to the point where it is no longer I who am at the forefront of my life, but Christ in me, who helps me, like these mystics and these saints of old, show people the face of Christ through my actions and love, rather than seeing my ideology or my opinions or myself or my ego at work dominating what defines my ministry. So as I welcome visionaries and mystics in our midst, I hope that you're willing to have that kind of courage and that kind of faith, and add to the conversation by commenting, liking, subscribing, and continuing on this journey, this walk with Jesus that is so exciting, so tremendously life-giving, and is filled with the redemption and the hope of eternal life with God through Jesus Christ, for those who have faith and have received God's gift of grace of salvation in Jesus Christ by that faith. Talk to you later.